So today we're going to be talking about Chapter 7, which is over memory. So what do we know about memory? So most people don't know how our memory works. But these are some facts that we do know about memory. So memory does not decay. So everyone has experienced the frustration of not being able to recall a fact from memory. It could be somebody's name, a term you can't remember on an exam, or where your car is parked. So it seems obvious that memories decay, like fruit going bad. But the research tends not to support this view. Instead, many researchers think, in fact, that memory has a limitless capacity. Everything is stored in there, but without rehearsal, memories become harder to access. This means it's not the memory that's going bad, it's the ability to retrieve it. But what's the point of a brain that remembers everything but can't recall a lot of it? Well, forgetting helps you learn. So the idea that forgetting helps you learn seems counterintuitive, but think of it this way. If you created a brain that could remember and recall everything, when this amazing brain was trying to remember where it parked your car, it would immediately bring to mind all the parked cars it had ever seen, so then it would have to sort through a whole bunch of stuff. Obviously, the only one that's of interest is the most recent time you parked your car, and this is generally true of most of our memories. So recent events are usually much more important than the ones that happened a long time ago. Think of your classes. If you're taking Calculus 4, it's important to recall details relevant to that course rather than remember your first math class in high school. Oops. To make our superbrain quicker and more useful in the real world, you'd have to build in some systems for discounting old and useless information. In fact, we all have one of these superbrains with a discounting system. We call it forgetting. So that's why forgetting helps you learn. As less relevant information becomes inaccessible, we are naturally left with the information that is most important to our daily survival. Lost memories can live again. So there's another side to the fact that memories don't decay. That's the idea that although memories may become less accessible, they can be revived. So even things that you have long been unable to recall are still there, waiting to be woken up. Experiments have shown that even information that has long become inaccessible can still be revived. Indeed, it's then relearned more quickly than new information. This is like the fact that you never forget how to ride a bike, but it doesn't just apply to motor skills, it also applies to memories. Next is that recalling memories alters them. So although it's a fundamental theory of memory, the idea that recall alters memory seems intuitively wrong. How can recalling a memory change it? Well, just by recalling a memory, it becomes stronger in comparison to other memories. So, for example, if you think back to one particular birthday from childhood and you recall getting a Lego spaceship, each time you recall that fact, the other things you got for your birthday that day become weaker in comparison. So the process of recall is actively constructing the past, or at least the parts of the past that you can remember. This is only the beginning. False memories could actually be potentially created by this process of falsely recalling the past. So actually, psychologists have been able to experimentally implant false memories. So this raises the idea that we can effectively create ourselves by choosing which memories to recall. And then finally, memory is unstable. So the fact that the simple act of recall changes memory means that it is relatively unstable. But people tend to think that memory is relatively stable. We forget that we forgot, and so we think we won't forget in the future what we know now. What this means is that students in particular vastly underestimate how much effort will be required to commit material to memory. So what else do we know? Everyone has the foresight bias. So you have an idea that you think is so great that it's impossible that you'll ever forget it, so you don't bother writing it down, but in 10 minutes you've forgotten and it doesn't come back. And we see the same thing in research. So in a study by Coriat and Bjork, people learned pairs of words like light, lamp, and then were asked to estimate how likely it is they'll be able to answer lamp when later given the prompt of light. They are massively overconfident, and the reason is foresight bias. When they get the word light, later, all sorts of things come to mind like bulb or shade, and the correct answer isn't nearly as easy to recall as they predicted. Next, when recall is easy, learning is low. So we feel really smart and clever when we recall something instantly. We feel kind of dumb when it takes us a long time. But in terms of learning, we should feel the exact reverse. If something comes to mind quickly, so we aren't working to recall it, then no learning occurs. When you have to work hard to bring something into consciousness, something cool happens. You're actually learning. So when people's memories are tested, the more work they have done to construct or reconstruct the target memory, the stronger the memory eventually becomes. This is why proper learning techniques always involve testing, because just staring at the information isn't good enough. Learning needs effortful recall. We also know that learning depends heavily on context. So have you ever noticed that when you learn something in one context, like the classroom, it becomes really difficult to recall when the context changes? That's because learning depends heavily on how and where you do it. It depends on who is there, what is around you, and how you learn. So it turns out, in the long term, people learn information best when they're exposed to it in different ways or different contexts. When learning is highly context dependent, it doesn't really transfer well or stick as well. Our memory has to be reloaded. So if you want to learn to play tennis, is it better to spend 1 week learning to serve, the next week the forehand, the week after the backhand, and so on? Or should you mix it all up with serves, forehands, and backhands every day? It turns out that for long-term retention, memories are more easily recalled if learning is mixed up. This is just as true both for motor learning, like tennis, as it is for declarative memory, like what's the capital of Venezuela. The trouble is that learning like this is worse to start off with. If you practice your serve quickly, then switch to forehand, you forget how to serve. So you feel things are going worse than if you just practice your serve over and over again. But in the long run, this kind of mix and match learning works best. One explanation for why this works is called the reloading hypothesis. So each time we switch tasks, we have to reload the memory. This process of reloading strengthens the learning. And finally, learning is under your control. So the practical upshot of these facts about memory is that we often underestimate how much control we have over our own memory. For example, people tend to think that some things are, by their nature, harder to learn, like chemistry, so they give up. However, techniques like using different contexts, switching between tasks, and strenuous reconstruction of memories can all help boost retention. People also tend to think that the past is fixed and gone. It can't be changed. But how we recall the past and think about it can be changed. So recalling memories in different ways can help us reinterpret the past and set us on a different path for the future. For example, studies have shown that people can crowd out painful negative memories by focusing on more positive ones. Okay. So, what is memory? So we're going to define memory as the retention of information or experience over time, and it's the result of 3 key processes: encoding, storage, and retrieval. And we're going to talk about each of those in more depth. So encoding, that's the process by which we transform what we perceive, think, or feel into an enduring memory. There we go. So things go from short-term memory, and then they're encoded, and then they go into long-term memory. Okay, so to begin the process of memory encoding, you have to pay attention to information. So there's a couple types of attention. There's selective attention, which involves focusing on a specific aspect of experience while ignoring others. We do this because our brain's resources are limited, so we can't attend to everything. There's also divided attention. So that involves concentrating on more than one activity at the same time. So like if you're listening to music or the television while you're listening to this lecture, that would be divided attention. Then there's also sustained attention, otherwise known as vigilance. It's the ability to maintain attention to a selected stimulus for a prolonged period of time. So, for example, paying close attention to your notes while studying for an exam is a good application of sustained attention. So now we're going to talk a little bit about different levels of processing, because this is another factor that influences memory. It's whether we engage with our information superficially or really get into it. So the term levels of processing refers to a continuum from shallow to intermediate to deep. So shallow level of processing, you're processing the physical and perceptual features and analyzing those. Intermediate level, your stimulus is recognized and labeled. And then deep, semantic, meaningful, and symbolic characteristics are used. So the more deeply we process, the better the memory. So for example, if we encode something meaningful about a face and make associations with it, we're more likely to remember the face. Okay, now we're going to talk about a couple of types of encoding processes. So there's elaborative encoding. So this is the process of actively relating new information to knowledge that is already in your memory. So for example, relating information from class to a personal experience that you have. We remember the meanings of words better than how a word looks or sound. There's also visual imagery encoding. So that's the process of storing new information by converting it into mental pictures. So why does this work? It's because it's related to memories that you already have. It assigns two mental placeholders, visual and verbal. And then finally, organizational encoding. So this is the act of categorizing information by noticing relationships among a series of items. So, for example, organizing a list of words by relatedness, or organizing concepts into hierarchies, or if you have a group of items, noticing the items that are different from one another. That's an effective form of organizational encoding. Okay. The next memory process after encoding something is to store it. So storage, this is the process of maintaining information in memory over time. There's 3 divisions of storage: sensory memory, short-term memory, and long-term memory. So sensory memory, that's a place in which sensory information is kept for a few seconds or less. It holds information from the world in its original sensory form for only an instant, not much longer than the brief time it's exposed to the visual, auditory, and other senses. It's very rich and detailed, but we lose the information in it quickly unless we use certain strategies that transfer it into short-term or long-term memory. There are 2 major types, iconic and echoic memory. So iconic memory, from the word icon, which means image, refers to visual sensory memory, which is only retained for about 1/4 of a second. Echoic memory, from the word echo, refers to auditory sensory memory, which was retained for up to several seconds. Okay, then we have short-term memory. So this is the place where non-sensory information is kept for more than a few seconds, but less than a minute. So it's a limited capacity memory system where our information is retained usually only for as long as 30 seconds unless we use strategies to retain it longer. So compared to sensory memory, it's limited in capacity, but it can store information for a longer time. There's the magical number that George Miller explains as the capacity of short-term memory of 7 ± 2. So individuals can usually remember 7 things in their short-term memory ± 2, and that's about the average thing that average number of things that individuals can remember in short-term memory without practicing it. So if a few seconds isn't enough time to help you remember, then what do? There are two processes that we're going to talk about: rehearsal and chunking. So rehearsal is mentally repeating information to keep it in your short-term memory. And chunking is combining small pieces of information into larger clusters or chunks. And then we have working memory. So working memory is the active maintenance of information in short-term storage. It includes the processes and operations we use to work with information in short-term memory. So, working memory is not the same thing as short-term memory. Short-term memory is sort of a passive storehouse where we store information just for a little bit until it moves to long-term memory. Working memory is an active memory system. So working memory capacity is separable from short-term memory capacity. Short-term has the 7 plus or minus 2. In working memory, if you have information that is in chunks, like we talked about with chunking, then most people can remember 4 plus or minus 1, so 3 to 5 chunks. Working memory can sort of be thought of as a mental blackboard, a place where we can imagine and visualize. Our brains manipulating and working with information to help us understand, make decisions, and solve problems. Within working memory, there are 3 components. So there's the phonological loop. It's specialized to briefly store speech-based information about the sounds of language. The visual spatial sketchpad. This stores visual and spatial information, including visual imagery. In both of these, the capacity is relatively limited and only lasts for a few seconds. And then the third component is the central executive. So this integrates information not only from the phonological loop and the visuospatial sketchpad, but also from our long-term memory. It plays important roles in attention, planning, and organizing. It sort of acts like a supervisor who monitors which information deserves our attention and which we should ignore. Okay. So finally we have long-term memory. So long-term memory is a type of storage that holds information for hours, days, weeks, or years. It's a relatively permanent type of memory that can store huge amounts of information for a long time. How much information can we actually store in our long-term memory? Well, as far as we know, it has no known storage limits, so you can store an infinite amount of things in your long-term memory. So long-term memory is broken up into 2 types of memory: explicit memory and implicit memory. So explicit memory is declarative memory. Implicit is non-declarative. Explicit involves the act of consciously or intentionally retrieving past experiences. Implicit means the influence of past experiences on later behavior and performance, even though people aren't really trying to recollect them and they're not aware that they're remembering them. So like riding a bike. And then explicit memory is broken down into semantic and episodic memory, and implicit memory is broken up into procedural memory and priming. So explicit memory, hold on. So this is the flow of information through the memory system. So we have a stimulus, our sensory organs perceive it, it goes into sensory memory for just a little while. Then if we pay attention to it, it goes into our short-term memory or our working memory for less than a minute. Then we can either forget it or use process of like rehearsal or chunking or anything like that. And then it can be encoded and consolidated into our long-term memory, where then we can retrieve it. Okay, so now we're going to talk about implicit and explicit memory more specifically. So implicit has procedural memory. So that's a gradual acquisition of skills as a result of practice. So, for example, like riding a bike, dancing, tying your shoes, driving a car. These things are automatically translated into actions. And sometimes you can explain how it's done to someone else. Like you can explain how you type to somebody else. But sometimes it's more difficult. Try to imagine explaining how to ride a bike to somebody. That would be pretty difficult. It's implicit. You're not really consciously recalling it. It's just implicitly being recalled. Then we have priming. So it's an enhanced ability to think of a stimulus, such as a word or object, as a result of a recent exposure to the stimulus. So a study in 1977 asked individuals to memorize a list of words, and for some people that list included the word moon, and for others it didn't. Later, these people were asked to name their favorite brands of grocery store items. Results showed that participants who had earlier memorized the word moon were more likely to say that their favorite detergent was Tide. So they were primed to think about tides because they had already thought about the moon. Okay, now we're going to talk about explicit memory. So remember, this is also called declarative memory. Within it, we have semantic memory. So this is a type of explicit memory pertaining to a person's knowledge about the world. It includes your areas of expertise, general knowledge of the sort you're learning in school, and everyday knowledge about the meanings of words, famous people, important places, and common things. So you would use your semantic memory to know that this is Albert Einstein. You also have your episodic memory. So this is a collection of past personal experiences that occurred at a particular time or place. So basically, retention of information about the where, when, and what of life's happening. Basically how we remember life's episode. It's autobiographical. So episodic memory includes the details of where you were when your younger brother or sister was born, what happened on your first date, or what you ate for breakfast this morning. So memory is organized by schemas. So schemas are a pre-existing mental concept or framework that helps people to organize and interpret information. Schemas from prior encounters with the environment influence the way individuals encode and make inferences about and retrieve information. Then a script. A script is a specific schema for an event, often containing information about physical features, people, and typical occurrences. This kind of information is helpful when people need to figure out what is happening around them. And now we're going to talk, so schema theory has little or nothing to say about the role of the physical brain in memory. So a new theory based on brain research has generated something called connectionism or parallel distributed processing, so PDP. So this is the theory that memory is stored throughout the brain in connections among neurons, several of which may work together to process a single memory. So, where memory is stored. So we know that the frontal lobes tend to store our episodic memory, so that's that autobiographical memory. The amygdala is involved in storing emotional memories. The temporal lobes are involved with explicit memory and priming. Same with the hippocampus, explicit memory and priming, and the cerebellum is related to implicit memory, or those processes that we don't have to actively recall. Okay, another process of memory is retrieval. So that's the process of bringing to mind information that was previously encoded and restored. So this takes place when information that was retained in your memory comes out of storage. So think of long-term memory as sort of like a library. You retrieve information in a fashion similar to the process you use to locate and check out a book in an actual library. So some retrieval cues, if someone were to give you a hint about something, thinking about something, feelings, and your senses, all of these things can help you retrieve information that is already stored in your memory. Okay, your book talks about the serial position effect. So that's the tendency to recall items at the beginning and end of a list more readily than those in the middle. So the primacy effect, that refers to better recall of items at the beginning of the list, and the recency effect refers to better recall for items at the end. So together with the relatively low recall of items from the middle of a list, this pattern makes up the serial position effect. Okay. So retrieval cues. So there's the encoding specificity principle. So this is the idea that a retrieval cue can serve as an effective reminder when it helps to recreate the specific way in which the information was encoded. So for example, you know your instructors when they're in a classroom setting, you see them there all the time, but if you run into them in an unexpected setting and in more casual attire, like at the gym in workout clothes, you might not be able to remember their name. Your memory might fail because the cues you encoded are not available for use. There's also state-dependent retrieval. So the tendency for information to be better recalled when the person is in the same state during encoding and retrieval. You can also call this context-dependent memory. So one example that people really like to use for state-dependent retrieval is if you are drunk when you're studying for the exam, theoretically you're going to perform better if you're drunk when you're taking the exam. I do not encourage either of those things, especially because most of you are underage, but that's a good example for you to think of when you think of state-dependent retrieval. You have to be in sort of the same state, physical or mental, when you're encoding and when you're trying to retrieve. That's when you're going to best remember things. Alright, and then we're going to talk about the difference between recall versus recognition. So recall is a memory task where you have to retrieve previously learned information, like on essay tests, like short fill in the blank, short answer, things like that. Recognition is a memory task where you only have to identify or recognize learned items, like on multiple choice tests. Recall tests, like essay tests, tend to have poor retrieval cues, but recognition tests, like multiple choice tests, you sort of have more retrieval cues because you know if a stimulus or an answer looks familiar. So it tends to be that recognition is a lot easier than recall. Okay, so special cases of retrieval. So autobiographical memory, a special form of episodic memory, is a person's recollection of his or her life experiences. An interesting discovery about autobiographical memory is the reminiscence bump. the effect that adults remember more events from the second and third decades of life than from other decades. Flashbulb memories. So this is a memory of an emotionally significant event that people often recall with more accuracy and vivid imagery than everyday events. So previous generations of Americans might have discussed flashbulb memories for the assassination of JFK. More recently, you might have flashbulb memories for the terrorist attack on 9/11 or the tragic shootings at Sandy Hook in 2012. So in 1890, William James said that an experience can be so emotionally arousing that it leaves sort of a scar on the brain. Personal traumas are candidates for such emotionally stirring experiences. So are traumatic events more or less likely to be remembered accurately? There's good evidence that memory for traumatic events is usually more accurate than memory for ordinary events. Stress-related hormones likely play a role in the memories that involve personal trauma. So, the amygdala, which plays a role in emotional memories, is likely the reason for some of the extraordinary durability and vividness of traumatic memories. Repressed memories. So, can an individual forget and then later recover memories of a traumatic event? There's a lot of debate surrounding this question. It's pretty controversial. Most studies of traumatic memory indicate that a painful life event like childhood sexual abuse is very likely to be remembered, but there's also some evidence that child sexual abuse may not be remembered. So if repressed memories are a thing, repression could be just considered a special case of motivated forgetting. So that's forgetting that occurs when something is so painful or anxiety laden that remembering it is intolerable. And then eyewitness testimony. So you should know now that memory is not really a perfect reflection of reality. So eyewitness testimonies, like other sorts of memories, can contain errors. And faulty memory, especially in these criminal matters, has very serious consequences. So if eyewitness testimony is inaccurate, the wrong person could go to jail or even be put to death, and the actual person who committed the crime might not even be prosecuted. So a lot of interest in eyewitness testimony focuses on distortion, bias, and inaccuracy in memory. So one reason for distortion is that, quite simply, memory fades with time, and unlike a video, memory can be altered by new information. So in one study, researchers showed students a film of an automobile accident and then asked them how fast the white sports car was going when it passed a barn. Although there was no barn in the film, 17% of students mentioned the barn in their answer. Bias is also a factor in faulty memory. So studies have shown that people of one ethnic group are less likely to recognize individual differences among people of another ethnic group. So eyewitness testimony does have a lot of problems, and you can look more into that if you're curious about it. So, forgetting. As we talked about at the beginning, our ability to forget actually helps us learn and it helps us retain new information. But forgetting happens a couple of different ways. So sometimes if people say they've forgotten something, they've not really forgotten it, rather they never encoded the information in the first place. So encoding failure occurs when the information was never entered into long-term memory. Retrieval failure. So this is if you've paid attention, you rehearsed the information, you know it, but you can't bring it to mind. That's a problem in retrieving information. So interference is one of the reasons that people forget. So according to interference theory, People forget not because memories are lost from storage, but because other information gets in the way of what they want to remember. So in other words, memory for one thing fails because memory for something else got in the way. There are two kinds of interference, proactive and retroactive. Proactive interference occurs when material that was learned earlier disrupts the recall of material learned later. So remember that pro means forward in time. Retroactive interference occurs when material learned later disrupts the retrieval of information learned earlier. So remember, retro means backwards in time. Another possible reason for forgetting is the passage of time. So according to decay theory, when we learn something new, a neurochemical memory trace forms, but over time this trace disintegrates. Decay theory suggests that the passage of time always increases forgetting. And we have the tip of the tongue phenomenon. So we're all familiar with this. When you feel like you know something and it's right there, it's on the tip of your tongue, but you can't quite remember it. So this reveals some interesting aspects about memory. So it demonstrates that we don't store all information about a particular topic or experience in one way. And then we have prospective memory. So retrospective memory is remembering the past. Prospective memory involves remembering information about doing something in the future. It includes memory for intentions. So it includes both timing, when we have to do something, and content, what we have to do. So transience is forgetting that occurs with the passage of time. This is the curve of forgetting. So during the storage phase and after encoding, but before retrieval. So we have this rapid decline from the time since original learning that levels off and remains relatively stable after several hours or a day. So absentmindedness can also cause us to forget. So that's a lapse in attention that results in memory failure. It happens most often when your attention is divided between two or more activities, or it also happens a lot when activities are automatic. So like driving. You might not remember driving to and from school today, because it's such an automatic skill. And then we talked about prospective memory, so remembering to do things in the future. Okay, now we're going to talk about amnesia. So there's two types of amnesia. The first is anterograde, so it's inability to transfer new information from short-term memory into long-term memory. So you can think of it like Finding Nemo and Dory. Or if you've ever seen 50 First Dates, like Drew Barrymore's character. Then there's also retrograde amnesia. So that's the inability to retrieve information that was acquired before a particular date, which is usually the date of an injury or an operation. So what are the purpose of our memory failures? Although they are annoying, they can be useful because forgetting helps to keep our mind clear. If we remembered every event and every image in our lives, no matter how much time had passed, our minds would be cluttered with a lot of useless details. So, yeah. And that is it for Chapter 7. There are some tips at the end of the chapter in the book that help you with studying tips. I'm not going to go over them here, but you can go over them yourself.